about the last 10 years. And is something that I'm just incredibly passionate about education and ensuring that students all have access to the education that not only do they deserve, but that they should have. And so I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Erica Haynes, to also introduce herself.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you guys. A few of you I have met with before, and I'm so excited to see you here this evening. My name is Erica Haynes, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the School and State Finance Project, and I've been there for about 9 years in May. So Melanie, it's back to you.
Erica. So we do, for anyone that has attended any of our presentations, you know that they are packed with information. So we are going to cover a lot, but just want everyone to know that you are always welcome to connect with us at any time after the presentation. We'll follow up with questions if you have questions, if you want to meet for coffee or do a Zoom, we can absolutely go more in depth into all of that. And you all will also get a copy of the presentation from this evening, so you can connect with all of the links and play around with that as well. So Jovi, we will go to, I think slide 2 has our contact information really briefly, and then the following slide, we'll just throw out our plug for our app. So the Ed Explorer app is an opportunity to have some school finance information at your fingertips. So it has demographic information for students, as well as school finance information and student performance. So just want to throw that out there. And then the next slide. So the School and State Finance Project, as Erica has been with the organization almost since its inception. We work across, we're a nonprofit organization that has been working across the state of Connecticut with policymakers, school administrators, educators, community leaders, and members since 2018, which truly feels, I think, a lot longer ago than it really is. But we write our own policies and have folks that run the numbers to ensure that all public school students receive equitable education funding that supports their learning needs. So we'll go to the next slide. And then just really briefly, our focus as an organization is and always will be on students, schools, and communities. So next. So Eric, you'll get to know Erica and I tonight, but I would be remiss to say that there are a lot of other folks in our organization that work behind the scenes to help us accomplish what we've gotten done in the last 9 years. And so we have secured over $500 million in need-based funding for Connecticut public school students. We've worked with nearly 15,000 community members in 80 communities across the state. In addition to funding, we've been working on some other things, including legislation around the quality of education for financial literacy requirements at the high school, for high school students, establishing a multilingual learner parent bill of rights, which I know many folks in the room tonight were a part of that, and then also revising the Connecticut teacher certification process. So we'll go next. So tonight we are going to focus on revenue sources at the federal and state and local level. You'll also get to know what's a budget and budgeting, get a sense of what that budgeting cycle is, and then what actions you can take and when. So what is a budget? I'm going to pass, sorry. So tonight we're going to talk about using this analogy of a story. So a budget document tells a story. It's a reflection of the district. It's a reflection of their priorities and what they're doing and what the district is doing. And so understanding how all of the funds are distributed from the school district to the individual schools is part of the conversation tonight. We also will say that there is no one right way to kind of plan for and distribute resources. Every school will have different needs. I think it's also important to acknowledge that you can only budget for what you can anticipate, and that will be a lot of the conversations tonight and the tensions that we see, because things change, right? Um, and also, as an organization, we don't endorse a specific method. However, we do believe that the allocation method used by districts should focus on ensuring that students have the resources that they need to be successful. And so now I got a little ahead of myself. I'm going to pass it over to Erica because this is her brainchild, and I need to give her full credit for coming up with this creative analogy in connecting a story in a budget. So Erica, I'm gonna let you take it away before I butcher it anymore.
That is not what you're doing. So we can go ahead, Jovi. Um, when we're talking about a budget, it really is the story of your community, right? You're looking at what's important, and if we're looking at it as a story, we're looking at some really key elements. And what I love about thinking about a budget this way is it gives you a way to talk about it with your kids too, right? Students should be able to understand this as well. So the first thing is the budget introduces you to key characters. So we're looking at New London's budget. And I love New London's budget, which is maybe one of the nerdiest things I've said. Um, but when you start, we need to know who the characters are. And when you look at their budget, you'll see who the students are. Who are we talking about when we're talking about New London students? And this is in every district. The same with the Board of Education, right? They are key characters in this story. They're deciding things. So we need to know who they are. So in any budget, you might not see these really cool pictures, and New London made this really easy for me. So shout out to New London. But when you look at them, you can find this in any budget. Go ahead. And so the next part of the story is what's the plot here? Right? What's happening? What do we need to know? What kind of journey are we on? And again, most budgets will tell you this. Some of them will just have a list, some of the things we did, or some of the things we want to do. I love, again, New London's because it really shows you the journey that the district is on, right? Where money goes and how it matters to the story of education and kids in New London. So they start by highlighting some of their accomplishments. And again, some of it isn't so much fun as in other districts. Other districts might just have a list, but you'll see it in some way, shape, or form in there. Go ahead. And if we're talking about a story, there has to be that that's okay. If we're talking about story, there has to be that tension point, right? Like what's going to happen? What's the like nail biter here? What are we really paying attention to? A lot of times this will start with things like budget drivers. What are the things that push a budget in a way that the district probably can't control? And so in these, you'll see in most budgets, again, budget drivers. And here they're talking about things like health insurance for teachers or wages, student outplacements, or a new preschool program. And so you get a sense of not just what they've done, but what is shaping how they're going to function? What are the constraints, or what are they trying to push beyond? Go ahead. Melanie, would you like to jump in here?
I can, yes. So when, Erica so eloquently talked about all of the components, and so your role within the budget story as well is that you're not just reading and kind of on the outside. You yourself and your student are a character in the story and really play an active and critical role. in this entire story. And so, as the story is unfolding, there are going to be a lot of choices that guide your advocacy efforts, which might include, talking with school officials, elected officials, and just asking those questions to build your knowledge. It can be really difficult, I think, to know sometimes what right questions are to ask, but I think the more conversations that we have with folks, those questions will come up, right? And then also talking with other folks in your community. We learn from each other, and from their experiences, their perspectives, and then, of course, taking action. And so you can influence sort of what those outcomes are, and choose what we would like to say, choose your own adventure. So we can go ahead, Jovi. So I wish I could see everyone in the chat, but for anyone that has already looked at a budget, please throw it in the chat and just, if you've seen it or what your thoughts are of it. I imagine that it is quite lengthy. The ones that I have seen have been hundreds and hundreds of pages. For example, Stanford's is more than 500 pages. And usually there is a summary or kind of like a table of contents at the beginning, which can kind of give you an overview. Um, and then it's all often organized into revenue and expenses, and those can be broken out in a couple of different ways. And so we will show you some examples of that as well. Hopefully they also have a glossary of terms with it, but Google might be your best friend while you're looking at this as well. So we can go to the next slide. So starting with revenue, um, and actually, Jovi, we can go to the next slide. Um, so a starting place for reviewing a budget and looking at the revenue is to look at how much money you have, and then where does it come from. So in a budget, money coming in is called revenue. Everyone is probably familiar with the term taxes. We all have tax dollars taken out of our paychecks, whether that's state and for the federal government. We also pay sales tax when we purchase items. We pay taxes on our property, whether that's a home, your vehicle. If anyone has a boat, apparently Connecticut taxes you on that too. And then businesses, right? So we have a lot of different ways in which our government, different levels of government collect money. We can go to the next slide. Um, and so education is a recipient of some of these revenues that are captured. We can go to the next slide. Through our various tax systems. These funds are distributed to our school districts in many different ways. So I know we have, and so we're going to get into that. And then going back to our story analogy, the revenue is really the starting point of our story. So this is kind of like chapter one, I would say. And this is going to come up in several of the conversations tonight. And as Erica pointed out just a bit ago, it sets the stage for some of these tension points that we're going to continuously see, especially when we start talking about how much money school districts need to fund their schools. So we can go to the next slide. So where does all of our money come from? There are three main buckets of funding. Connecticut spends approximately 13.3 billion with a B dollars on education. So we have the three colors. That blue little piece at the top, those are our federal dollars. So that comes in at about 8%. However, this does still include some of those COVID dollars that we saw. And so we are going to start seeing a reduction in that number. And so we'll get back down to about $600 million. The majority of funding shown in green are local property taxes that come in at about 57%. And then lastly, we have that orange chunk in the middle, and those are our state funds. So that's about 35.5% or $4.7 billion. Go to the next slide. And then the next one. So we're going to start talking about revenue. We're going to kind of work our way down the little bar chart. So funds received from the federal government are typically designated for specific programs. Um, and you may come across grants such as Title I or Title III. I know a few of us were talking about some things actually before everyone got on earlier. But school districts must use these funds as they are specified by the government. And that will also require some reporting on how those grant funds are spent, right? Um, it's also important to note that when the federal government is determining how much money to give the states, they take into consideration the wealth of the state. And as you all know, Connecticut in the big picture is one of the top wealthiest states in the country. And so therefore, as a state, we do receive less funding in comparison to other states as well. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to give you a specific example. So we'll use Title III tonight, a Title III grant. And so what is it? The name itself is not descriptive. And the government also likes to use Roman numerals. And so this grant was actually established with federal legislation in 1965. And its purpose is to provide assistance for English learners to meet proficiency. These funds would be used to support programs that will help language learners to meet the state academic requirements or state standards. But these funds are supplemental. So there's still this expectation that the state and local governments are also going to provide funding for programs for MLL students. We can go to the next slide. So what does this actually look like in a budget document? And I realize with the dual screen, we're going to be squinting a lot tonight. But again, you'll get a copy of the presentation. But so we pulled a screenshot from Stanford Public Schools. So you will see that first top line is the Title III grant. That the Stanford Public Schools receive. It gives you the amount that's estimated, and then also you have your descriptions to the far right. You'll also notice there are some other title grants that are under that. Those in particular are to support students with disabilities or additional learning needs through the IDEA. So federal funding is pretty limited. Again, as you saw in just that little blue segment at the top of that bar graph. So the next, we're going to work our way down to the orange. So we're going to talk about the state funding. And Connecticut uses what's called the Education Cost Sharing Formula, or ECS. So Jovi, we can move forward. So the ECS formula, we can go to the next one too, perfect, is how the state distributes funds to municipalities for their local or regional public school districts. So I'll also note Connecticut has 10 funding formulas. We will not get to those all tonight, but just know that ECS is where we, primarily fund most of our schools in Connecticut. And so I'm going to pass it over to Erica to share a little bit more about why we have the ECS formula. We can go to the next slide, Joby.
You, Melanie. Thanks, Jovi. You are navigating beautifully. So why we have an ECS formula. First, I think it's important to just echo what Melanie said. The ECS formula is the lion's share of state dollars through this formula, and it funds both local and regional public schools. And it's really interesting how we got here. Way back prior to this lawsuit, so prior to 1977, and in this case, history matters. The state was funding schools by giving everybody an equal amount across the board. And this lawsuit said that essentially an education funding system that allowed property wealthy towns to spend more on education with less effort really impeded a child's constitutional right to an equal education. They weren't getting the same education in Greenwich as they were in Bridgeport. And I hear a lot of you going, it is still a problem. And I hear that. But what this case did is say that the role the state has in education funding is really centered in equity, and that the grant that kind of came out of this court case is supposed to make up the difference between what a community can afford to pay and what it costs to run a public school system. So that's the purpose. And I do want to just call out the timeline. So we had the court case and the ruling in 1977. The first ECS formula happens 11 years later because we are very slow and deliberate in our state. And I want to point out that this formula has gone through multiple iterations. And the history of it is that they start a formula phase in, they say it's too expensive to do what we're supposed to do right away. We're going to need 10 years to climb the stairs to fully funding our schools. And never has the state ever made it to full funding where they are actually meeting their fair share. We are on track to do that for the first time, and that will happen next school year. It will have been shortened from a 10-year phase in to an 8-year phase in. And I want to put here, before I give it back to Melanie to go through how this works, I just want to say that's a massive change. And that massive change happened because community members advocated. So that doesn't happen through people writing policy, right? We've had a lot of policies. We're seeing this change because of parents and because of community members. So Melanie's going to walk you through that. And I think it helps you understand not just where the state's share is coming from, but what is missing from that calculation. So go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So the ECS formula has a couple of different components. So I want to start with the foundation amount. This is the amount of money that it costs to educate the general student without any additional learning needs. So this is your average bear. In Connecticut, the amount is $11,525 per pupil. Now there's a few caveats here, right? So this amount is set by the legislature. And so as a result, this number is based on what the state can afford to pay, not necessarily calculated using any math. It is on how much it actually costs to educate a student without additional learning needs. And so just kind of knowing that that is at the time, back in 2013, that is what the legislature decided that they could afford to pay. In 2013, they raised it from 9,687 to 11,525, which is where we still are today. The amount has not changed in quite some time. And so that is challenging because we're not accounting for inflation or anything. We know that things cost more now. And so we can go to the next slide. So we start with the foundation amount, and then the next piece of the formula is we have 3 weights that do recognize additional student needs. Research over the years has demonstrated that students living in lower income households could use some additional resources, right? And so students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, and they will receive an additional 30%. Districts that have over 60% of students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch are considered in concentrated poverty. So there is an additional 15% weight that is added for anything over 60%. So if a community is under 60%, then only the students that qualify, right, would get that 30%. And then those, say a community has 70%, that 15% would be added to that 10%, right? The difference between 70 and 60. And then lastly, we also have a weight for multilingual learners, and that's at 25%. We know that these scholars are not only learning a new language, but also all of that content material at the same time. And so absolutely extra support is needed there. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, that, you know, this is the state's contribution that is supplemented by that Title III grant for some school districts. And I also want to say that not every school district gets those Title III grant dollars. But for the state of Connecticut, um, we go through this formula. So we can go to the next slide. And so to put this into real context and to show you some numbers, we've provided the calculations in this table that sort of demonstrate what that would actually look like in dollars. So for a student that qualifies for free and reduced price lunch, it's an extra $3,458. So that brings that total to $14,983. We would then do, if a student is living in concentrated poverty, it would be that $5,186. And so you can also see that this is not a one or the other, because you could have a student who's a multilingual learner and also it qualifies for free and reduced price lunch, right? And so for that, it would be a 6,339. And so it's one of those things that there can be a combination of needs for a student. So just want to also keep that in mind, that the formula recognizes that. All right, we can go to the next. So we've talked about the pieces of the formula that take into consideration the student. So the other half of the formula is where the state takes into consideration the municipality's ability to fund its schools. This is called the base aid ratio. This is determined by two factors. It is determined by property wealth, which is a 70% weight in that formula. And then, so that's the value of the property within the municipality. And then the state also looks at what the income of the residents are, and that is 30% of that weight within the formula. Go to the next slide. So the formula, we will say, is not perfect. It is also something that changes from year to year. I really want to highlight this because it adds to the complexities of trying to calculate every year and to anticipate how much in-state funding districts will get. We know that enrollment changes from year to year, even within the school year. Property wealth can change, especially in a reevaluation year. We also are challenged with some data lags. And so for some of this information could be a year old or more that we're basing some of these calculations on. And so it can create some of those challenges as well. If we go to the next slide, it actually shows the list of all of the factors that we look at when calculating the ECS. So you can see that there's a lot to be taken into consideration and a lot of opportunities for things to change. Now, I think, you know, there's one thing that we haven't mentioned or talked about yet, and that's because it's not considered in the ECS formula, and that is special education, which I think we all know is actually a very large portion of municipal school budgets. So I'm going to pass it over to Erica to talk a little bit more in depth about how special education funding works and what that looks like in Connecticut.
Yeah, so that was missing, right? And you all were waiting for it to show up, and it wasn't there. So we're going to talk a little about special education, and Jovi, you can go ahead to slide 30. I don't know, then two ahead, wherever we are. There we go. Um, so how does Connecticut fund special education? So they've got this formula, and you just saw all of the pieces of the formula. And what Connecticut says is, yeah, we gave you all those pieces, but also a part of that money is also our contribution to special education. So our money is in there. Um, and you're thinking, but it isn't, because there was a formula and it wasn't in the formula, and it's not. So it's kind of like if you go to the dollar store, you buy something for your dollar, and as the cashier is going to put it in the register, you grab your dollar back from her and grab another thing and try and use that same dollar. It it doesn't make a lot of sense. So they say their funding for special education is primarily in the ECS formula. And so the next time Connecticut funds special education is through the excess cost grant. And you might have heard a little about this. It's certainly been part of the news lately. And so what the excess cost grant is when a student, when a district has to spend more than 4.5 times the district per pupil average, what they spend on a student, when they spend 4.5 times, after that, they are able to start submitting for reimbursement to the state so that the state will reimburse the district. Um, it's important to note that the state doesn't reimburse them at 100%. The state has reimbursed at, on average, 70%. But because it's what's called a capped fund, means they only have so much money. So as claims come in, it gets divided, and the number, the percentage, the reimbursement gets lower and lower. So when we started, well, actually, so for fiscal 24, last year's school year, the fund was estimated to be about $80 million underfunded for um, reimbursement at statutory levels, right? What they should be giving to districts. That's where we estimate we ended. Currently, the fund is estimated to be about $108 million underfunded. So this school year, it's grown, and it's grown rapidly. And what that means is districts got a letter in December, the end of December, saying the state is estimating that they're going to get reimbursed at about 62%. Now, if you're a school district, that's a lot less, and you aren't expecting it. And that's part of what you see as budgets kind of get talked about, and why they're unpredictable, particularly for every local school district as they're trying to figure out how much they're going to fund education. Go to the next slide, please. So I told y'all they say it's in the ECS formula. Special education was its own line item in the state until 1995. And the General Assembly said, why don't we just mush it into the education cost sharing? And so they said, we're going to increase the foundation amount by $911 so that it's buried in that foundation amount as part of the formula. But $911 isn't what it costs to educate a special education student, and the unique learning needs of the students who are identified under the massive umbrella of special education. And so that's how they kind of got to where we are. You can go ahead, Jovi. Local revenue. I'll keep going on this. So So I just told you there's a bunch of instability there, right? With this special education piece that's not funded and certainly changes through the school year. And what's happening right now in every community is school districts are trying to figure out what their budget is. And in Connecticut, we rely more heavily on property taxes than most states do. So about 57% of our school budgets are coming from local property taxes. And that's because at the city level, there aren't many ways for a city or town to raise money. It's property tax, it's intergovernmental revenue, money that the state gives the city, and money that the federal government gives the city, and then other revenues, which are everything from building permits to dog licenses. So if you have a dog and you haven't gotten a license, just know that when you go and you pay for that, you're helping your city and your town, and you're also helping your school district. Go ahead, Jovi. So when we're talking about property taxes, we can go to the next one. This is a problem, right? And this is almost the problem that we started with that got us to the education cost sharing formula. We rely incredibly heavily on local property taxes. And what that means is that poor communities struggle to raise funds to run their schools appropriately. And wealthier suburban communities have a whole lot more access to resources. So we can look at what this means. Go ahead, Joby. No, in Connecticut, the value of grand lists, and this is property taxes, right? The ability to raise money. Um, there is a $62.4 billion difference between our wealthiest property wealth community and our least property wealthy community. And while when we look at what does that look like when we talk about the number of people are there, there is still a massive difference in access to wealth and access to property taxes to run things like schools. So you see there, the state median is about 2.6 billion. Greenwich is at 62.6 billion. Scotland and Union are really low. And in Scotland, I think there's one business, and the rest is essentially residential. Go ahead, Jovi. So what does this look like per person, right? When we look at those big numbers, it's like, yeah, but I've never heard of Scotland or Union. They must be really tiny, and they are. But when we look across cities and we look at the state median is about 170,000. In Greenwich, they have about $842,000 worth of property per person. But in Hartford, you've got about 66, almost $67,000 per person. And if we're looking at somewhere like Waterbury, it's at almost 74,000. So there's a massive difference in availability of taxable property, which is what our whole system of school funding really sits on. Go ahead, Jovi. And so in this one, what we're looking at is property taxes on a $300,000 house. And I use the left side of the slide because I think it just shows some of the massive differences. If you had a $300,000 house in Greenwich, you'd pay about $2,500 in property taxes. But if you have a $300,000 house in Waterbury, you're paying more than $10,000 in property taxes. And so usually, we'll have this conversation and people will say, but you're not going to buy a $300,000 house. And, oh, Jackie, we can talk more about it. You're not going to buy a $300,000 house in Greenwich, right? But you could buy a $1.2 million home in Greenwich, and you would pay the same property taxes as that $300,000 house in Waterbury. And it's not going to be the same house, right? um, and so what it is that communities that have the highest needs often have the least amount of resources in order to support their community needs. And in the ideal, we wouldn't rely on property taxes so much. Really, we'd rely more on the state. Because what happens is if Waterbury's schools need more money, they have to tax even more. And yet they can't. And when we talk about need, what we see is the cities have more students generally who have unique learning needs. That includes multilingual learners, English learners, and we have more children who are on free and reduced price lunch. And that matters to the learning experience. So it is disproportionate. I think Renee said it's a little upside down, right? And it's upside down because we rely on the local side and not the state side. And Connecticut does that at a significantly higher rate than other states. So I will turn it over to Melanie.
Great. Thanks, Erica. And we can move on to the next slide and the next one after that. So really the question is, what does this mean for communities? And I think Erica very eloquently stated, all of the challenges there and the differences between our communities. And so when you are looking at your own community, the question is, how much does your community need to contribute towards funding your public schools? So typically to calculate this, we usually have an understanding of what the federal revenue should be. In theory, with the ECS, we should sort of have an idea of what state revenue we should expect, right? And so when we put those two numbers together, we subtract that from what the school budget is. So the budget that the district has proposed / approved, right? And then you're left with what the municipality has to contribute, right? And so this is a challenge, and this is where those tensions really lie in those conversations in your own communities during budget season. And so we'll go on to the next, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the expenses. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the sources of revenue and where it comes. And so we'll move on to talk a little bit more about what does the money actually get spent on. So a district's budget may show expenses in various ways. So whether that's by the income source, like the grants we've already discussed this evening, it could be by grade cluster, it could show the expenses by schools within a district, or even specifically by program. And since these budgets are hundreds of pages, you're often going to see expenses shown in multiple ways. And because there is no one way to look at money. And so the next few slides, again, we pulled some examples from New London. And so we could go forward to the next slide. And again, you all are gonna, I don't even think you can see it while squinting, so I apologize. So you can take a look at this when we email out the slide deck. But what this table shows is New London shows a chart of accounts by object. And so when we talk about object, we're really just talking about categories. So in this example, New London has taken the category of wages and has broken it down into different salary or hourly positions based on role and certification. So that left column is just going to have the title, and then the right column has a further description. Um, and just to provide clarification, on the and there are numbers on the far left that are going to correspond with the budget document. And again, I know it's really hard to see. And we can go on to the next example. Um, Another way expenses can be shown are through program narratives. I think when you also think of a budget, you just think of columns and tables of numbers and dollar signs. But a lot of school districts have actually done a great job of giving more information and breaking this information out. And so a program narrative is another way to look at how districts are expending their money. Um, and so this program narrative and specifically is looking at the K to 5 core programs, which is focused on instruction. So how the school districts are, how this school district in particular for K to 5 is meeting those goals on English, math, science, social studies. And then also towards the bottom, it also lists out what the model aims to do. And so like what are the goals that they're trying to achieve with this program? What are the outcomes, right? Um, and then the table at the bottom shows the staffing information. So when we're thinking about the cost of instruction, how many educators do we need to implement, right, the instruction to teach our children? And so this table actually breaks it down by the number of positions in each of the schools, the K to 5 schools in New London. And then the far right part of the table shows kind of all of those totals for the full district. So Jovi, we could go to the next slide, please. Um, and I know that this is a lot of information. And again, everyone's its budgets are going to look a little different. And especially each district has their very own unique way of showing this information, as Erica can also attest to. And so it can be distracting. And so we just want to really look at the highlights. And by highlights, like what is changing? Um, and so a budget is typically going to show sort of like what is being anticipated. But then a lot of times they will also show what they spent in the previous year. So you can make that comparison of what did we spend last year? And also what did we budget for last year? What did we actually spend? Because those numbers are usually different, right? Because we know so many things change throughout the school year. And then you can compare that to what is budgeted for this year. Um, and a lot of times they'll also include the actual spending for the current year, which you'll see is usually called year to date or YTD for short. So in these comparisons, you can see a percentage of an increase or decrease. And this is really an integral part of the story. Um, it's the story within the spending component. The expense section tells us where the money is going, how it's changing, which ultimately is going to tell us what the priorities are of the district. Um, and so your kind of part or what's missing is the why. And so this is where you can kind of come in and start asking those questions to better understand why these decisions are being made. Because we can see them now in black and white, but we also know that there is a lot of gray behind those numbers and conversations that are happening. And Erica, I just want to see if there's anything I missed in this section. that you wanted to add?
No, I think you didn't. I think the interesting thing is it makes way less sense than you think it's going to, right? And I think sometimes that is it's a little hard to wrap your head around that, that special ed dollars are in theory in there even though they aren't, right? That places who can afford the least are having to have the highest property taxes. There's so much in this that is irrational, that I think it just makes you shake your head a little bit. And if I had to guess, people were shaking their head a little bit. And I want people to know that's not you. That's this. It isn't the best system, right? There are things in here that just don't make sense. And the biggest one is certainly, where is the funding for special education?
We can go to the next slide, please. So the next slides are, the next two slides will actually show you how Danbury Public Schools had shown those budget drivers. And this is something that a lot of school budgets, if they don't, they should include sort of explaining why they might be asking for more money. In this example, Danbury for this fiscal year, this is not probably this year's budget. We pulled this from a previous budget, but in this academic year, right, they're asking for a $31 million increase in their budget for that year. And so they highlight these drivers to kind of help say, this is why we're asking for more money. And a lot of these, to show either these big new expense areas or areas that are rapidly changing, that are going to influence the overall budget. And so Danbury here highlights that there's, $10 million in COVID dollars that are going away. There are growing enrollment at the high school. They also have a new school, the academies that they're going to be opening that are going to have a lot of new expenses that the district hasn't had previously. And then also an increase in the support for their multilingual learners, right? And so these are some of the ways that they're seeing changes in their budgets. And we can go to the next slide. And so this
Melanie,
is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in for a
Yeah.
second because I know, as Jovi moves us to that next slide, it's okay, Jovi. Um, Danbury changed the way they presented their budget. And so this was last year's, and they got a lot of really positive feedback. And I want to point that out because I think that it's important to know when a budget isn't clear, you should definitely ask more questions, ask where things are, let them know it's not clear. That's how they get better at it. So after years of trying and getting closer, last year's presentation was the first time that folks really commented and said this was really helpful. So I put that out there to just say, this feedback, when you learn about this and you might not see it in your district, your voice changes things. So asking questions and not thinking it's just you. I'm going to encourage all of you to do that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate it so much. And thanks for managing the chat and answering a lot of questions in there too. And so Danbury, this is probably the next slide or a couple of slides after the one we just saw, where now they're going to go even deeper. They're going to get more specific. And so this slide in particular, they're looking at the growth of enrollment at the high school. So it's showing the breakdown that they need for additional staff, additional space, the increase in transportation costs, kind of based on these anticipated numbers. I think enrollment is one of those factors that are beyond the district's control, right? People move all the time. And Danbury is actually a little unique, I think. To have such a rapidly growing student enrollment. I think a lot of towns in Connecticut are actually seeing a decline. But these are challenges, right, that need to be considered. And I also think that this shows like how quickly things add up as well. So we can go on to the next one, the next slide. So we're going to look just thinking a little bit more about helpful tips as we kind of wrap up this last part of the budget section, and then we'll get into the process. Um, and so no two budgets are alike. I think Erica highlighted this too, but if you can't find what you're looking for, you can ask. You have every right to ask, whether that's calling central office, talking to someone in the finance department, or reaching out to your Board of Ed. All of those folks should be able to point you in the right direction or get you access to what you're looking for. And then also if there's certain information that you're looking for and it's not there, bringing that up as Erica highlighted. We can go on to the next slide, please, Jovi. And we've again talked about how long some of these documents are. And actually when we did this presentation with another group, one of the participants actually uploaded their budget, their district's budget to ChatGPT, and it provided a summary for them, which I thought was a really unique way to also process a lot of information. But really thinking about what are you most interested in and what is most important to you, and focus on those aspects of the budget. It doesn't necessarily make sense to look at what, maybe the benefits of an educator versus how many teachers do you have, right? Or how much they're spending on some of these operational things when you're really interested in art and music. Just really focus on the areas that are most important to you. And don't be afraid to kind of back out a little bit and look at it. It takes time. This is not something that I think nobody really spends a lot of time doing this unless it's their job. Um, so just kind of keep that in mind, and give yourself a ton of grace, because it is complicated. So, all right, we are going to move on and away from just how to read a budget, but now thinking about the process. So we know where the revenue comes from. We know how expenses are developed. Um, and so looking at the whole story, we're thinking about what do we want to happen? What does success look like during the development of the process? That's okay, Joby, you can go forward. Um, and so during the development process, you can actually go, yeah, perfect. Is thinking about where your voice can be heard. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But um, we know that districts can't afford everything, right? And so they are going to go through that prioritization process while the budget's created. But there are a lot of questions that we can ask in the bigger picture of what is the true vision? What do we want to see? And then we can back ourselves into that budget. And so some of the things that we need to consider, we can go to the next slide, Jovi, um, is what the timeline is for making decisions. Time moves really fast. And there are timelines in which decisions have to be made. And so it can also mean that decision makers do not always have enough time to discuss all of their options. Sometimes they have to make decisions with just the information that they have. And again, we talked about that long list of factors that ECS considers, and things that are outside of, the district's control. A district can only budget for what they anticipate. We all know that students can transfer between school districts in the middle of the year. And if you have a student with unique needs as well, and those services can be more than what the district had budgeted for, and then so what happens, right? It creates a lot of the superintendents in the central office, while they may not always feel like they're making the decisions that we want, there's a lot of information that they're processing, and a lot of information that they don't have that they're making decisions on. All right, so we can head on to the next slide. So, this is where you come in. Engaging in the community is a huge part, and should be a huge part of the process, and ensuring that your voices are being heard. And too often we come together, right, once the budget has already been drafted, um, and that, at that one time of year, right, when they have that one public hearing, that everyone can share, how they're feeling. But, once that has kind of been already developed, it's a heavier lift to make changes to it, once it's out there. And so, there's a lot of opportunities throughout the year that we can share that information. And so, if we go to the next couple slides, we first highlight Stanford. They have their budget timeline. So, their budget is already drafted by January. And then through the spring, it makes its way to each of the stakeholders in the community for review and changes. I think it's also important to note that each stakeholder, in this process has different authorities. So the Board of Education can make line item changes, to their budget. Whereas in Stanford, their Board of Finance and Board of Representatives are just going to make a cut with a general number. So that number is going to get handed back down to the central office, and their team is going to be responsible for making that amount work. Um, and so just kind of keeping that in mind again, when we're also holding our elected officials accountable, to some of the decisions that they're making. If we go to the next slide, we have West Hartford as another example. Their process really starts early December and into January. Um, and so conversations about the vision and priorities really need to happen in the fall. So that things can start to marinate and folks have time to get that information out there. And so if we go to the next slide, we have a great little infographic slash, I guess just graphics, not really an infographic. um, Kind of showing you the different times of year. And when I say that, advocating throughout the year. It doesn't always have to be if something is not going well. I think we, too often also only voice our concerns when something is not going how we want it. But I know that our elected officials would also like to hear when things are working, because then they'll also know to prioritize that and keep those things in the budget. Of course, there's always going to be room for improvement. But in that fall time when they're starting to have those conversations, that is a great time to start having that conversation with your superintendent, with your administrators, going to a Board of Education meeting, and sharing your thoughts then rather than waiting until the budget is already approved. Because I also guarantee that you have thoughts on last year's budget, right? That didn't work. And so this is the opportunity to do that. Um, and so, we'll do that in the fall, and then, they start to do all of their approvals throughout the winter into the spring. And then during that sort of spring and summer is when they're really doing the implementation, monitoring, collecting feedback and data on that. And then we start the process all over again. So we can go to the next slide. Um, And so when you're thinking about advocating, there's also a lot of different, ways to do that. We've talked about funding at different levels. And so you can reach out to your state representatives here in Connecticut. There are some conversations happening in the legislature now that will affect, state funding, in the future. And so you can reach out to your elected officials. You could also testify, at a committee public hearing on bills, or just submit written testimony if you don't want to speak. At the local level, attending those meetings. And so not just the Board of Education, is it the Board of Finance or City Council, Board of Reps, that are also approving, right, that final budget. and weighing in during your public comment. And then also just, introducing yourselves to the superintendent, and reaching out to those folks to just let them know who you are and what's important to you. And then also in the public space, just, you could write a letter to the editor, and also just talking to people that are in your circle, and seeing what else they feel is important and sharing that information. So we can go to the next slide. Um, I think the other piece is that this is a lot. And we all cannot be everywhere all the time. And I feel that now. And this is my job. And there's like 3 public hearings happening in Hartford at the same time that I'm interested in, right? So it's really important that we can find other folks, that we can kind of, divide and conquer. So can we split up? We like to say find your 5, right? So one person gets to go to city council this month, someone else goes to board of ed. And then you can kind of share out, and if you want to make it a social thing, great. Or you have a text group, right, to just kind of text those updates. That can be really helpful. And so it's not feeling like you have to do all of the things all of the time. And also gives you an opportunity to talk to other like-minded people or people that are interested in, um, the issues that you're interested in as well. We can go to the next slide. And then the next one. um, I know we have all of our transition slides. So really just kind of wrapping some of this up, and then we'll definitely have time, I think, for some questions. But staying engaged. And so I would give you kind of this task as you leave tonight and thinking about what are you going to do next? What is your next action step? And that can look different for everyone in the room tonight. Again, we all can't be all and do all of the things, but there is one, I bet everyone can do one thing, right? In the next couple of weeks, especially with this being prime budget time for the our local districts, as well as at the state. Um, and that could just be having a conversation with somebody else and helping to kind of even share information that you learned tonight. Um, or it is signing up to speak, which again, Erica or I are happy to meet with you. We will have dinner with you before you go to that Board of Ed meeting, get you all ready to go, or read your testimony, right? Whatever support you need to do the things, we are there for you. And I know there's a lot of other folks in this room that are willing to do the same. So it just goes back to that again, that you don't need to do this alone. And we're all here because we care about it. So I think that is my last slide, if I am correct. So there are some additional slides in the back just for information for folks that want to look through that, but I will, I guess, open it up for questions, thoughts, comments. Jovi, I don't know if you had anything else that you needed time for at the end, but
I do have, I'm gonna just share that
yep.
screen. I know that these are some examples, but I'm just going to share the survey screen, please. We have time to go through questions. I know that I saw that there's people with their hand up, but I'm just going to leave this on here for just a few seconds, so that we can get that survey, please. This is very important for us, right? We have partners. This data helps us, right, continue to do this work and to support our, our partners. So please, if you have the time, if you can just please do the quick survey. And then I will stop sharing. I'll give it one more minute and then I'll stop sharing so then we can have a discussion.
While people are doing that, Jovi, I will just touch on 2 things. The first is federal funding. I know Helen was asking, um, and we don't know a whole lot, right? Right now, federal funding is really unpredictable. So we don't know what they're actually going to do. I think that our legislature is very well aware that there is a threat for them to take away funding, um, and they're making plans. I think that this is one of the few times where we can breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief that federal funding is about 4.2%. of our K-12 funding. So it's not, in some other states, it's significantly higher, right? So Connecticut can think about that and plan. And I know that our legislature is looking at that. And the other thing I wanted to address was what's been happening with special education funding. We just saw $40 million pass, and that was for special education. That was specifically for excess cost. And that $40 million would have bumped the reimbursements from the 62% range to about 70%. The governor is going to veto that. And now we wait to see what the legislature chooses to do. And the legislature has a couple of options. They have a couple of different processes. So overriding the veto is one. But they have other processes that can get them to that $40 million for special education. And so they're looking at all of those options. So those are a couple of things I just wanted to throw out there.
I have a question. And I wanted to add a comment. I know that recently, Erica, you had shared what was it? There was a bill, SB
1391.
Yes, and let me tell you about the nice tool that they have. So we know that our families are intimidated to do testimonies, right? We know that everyone is working and even trying to come up with a testimony or how to create it, right? It's time consuming and since everything is just it's just intimidating. But I recently used their tool that they have, which is amazing. It gave you the option of seeing the bill right there from their tool. It also gave you the option to put your testimony in from that tool. And they also gave you a sample letter that you can use as your testimony. So I thought that was really, really cool for our families to share. And I wish so many others could do that because it was really nice to see that process and so that your voice could still be heard even if you're intimidated writing the letter or going in person. This was a really, really nice tool. I'll put it in the chat. I'm gonna look for it in my email now, but it was so nice. And then maybe I could share the screen so that you guys can see how nice it was. And then my next question, I'm not even sure if it's appropriate. Now, I know that Connecticut, we rely on the taxes from our towns. What do other states do if it's not how we do it? And is there a better way of doing it? And is it something that could be adopted in Connecticut?
Oh, yeah. So there is a better way to do it. Connecticut is one of two states that doesn't have a county form of government. And this matters because as we try to fund, some of our funding is redundant, right? We have very small districts. We have over 200 school districts in Connecticut. We have 169 cities and towns. In Vermont, what they did is make a minimum school district size so that towns that are close together had to work together. County government does that same sort of thing and distributes property taxes in an equitable way to reduce the burden on each town. I don't see Connecticut going for that anytime soon. And yet, yeah, it's just us and Rhode Island. And as with everything, I say Rhode Island is just waiting for us to do something. So definitely that's a sad answer though. Like I usually want to be like, yes, here's what we can do. We are writing the policy to do it. But I think it's going to be a while. Although I will say, I think more and more it's community members like us that are saying it's really costing us a lot to have our little tiny towns. And, we don't have the same political need that politicians do, to have their corner of the world. And so there's a system that we're propping up. Every school district has to have a superintendent.
Mhm.
So we have districts with 100 kids. They have to have a superintendent. So these things become really expensive. And when you think about it, backing it out is probably the best thing. Yeah, and I did drop it in the chat for folks to click into, and you can explore. There's a couple of great links in there.
Can everyone see the screen?
I can.
Okay. So this is a really neat tool. It gives you information about the bill. You can click on the bill. This would bring you to the bill on the CGA website, where you can gain information and see information on the bill, which you can also testify here. However, the neat thing about here is that I'm not sure if I do it again, Melanie, if it's gonna, I'm not sure what happens if I were to do it again, but here you would put your name, your last name, all the information, take action, and then here you could write your own, or you can use the template that they provided, which is really neat.
Jovi, I think I can share my screen and
Okay,
I have that one. Let me,
let me
although
make sure I give you
Melanie's,
co-host. Just give you access to share your, go ahead. Now you can.
okay, I'm telling you, Melanie is cringing because she's like, oh, Erica sharing, this never works well. So, so let me just see. Hold on for 1 second. I am not as quick and adept as you are for sure. But when you click into this, mine is a little different because Jovi actually submitted. So that's why you're not seeing. But you have this message here to start. And I think what's really important, for me that you all should know is that you can scroll down, but right down here, you can click on edit and you can change any of this. And that's perfectly fine. And I mean that from start to finish. So if it's a bill that we think is amazing and you think this isn't exactly great, or I like some parts, but I don't like other parts, you get to click in and do that. But what this does is, I don't know, from what, people told me this weekend, there are two things that stop us from submitting testimony. One is time, and this makes it easier for everybody with time. And the second is just, where do I start? Or how do I start? Who am I supposed to address this to? So if you even wanted to copy and paste this and take it and do your own thing, that's okay. It's about making sure you all have the option in as many ways as possible.
I love it because I think it gives accessibility. Michelle, I know that you have your hand up.
Yes, so I had a quick question because I use that really adaptable little link, and I started to look up my district because that's what we do, right? We all go, ooh, what's this kind of funky thing? Let's go look and see what this says. Oh, this is really nice. I got numbers and it's at the palm of my hand. Like, it's so efficient, right? Who doesn't love that? Yeah. And I just really was curious about how the data is collected on there. If the school is submitting that, because I noticed it said that we have 5 schools in our district, but we actually only have 3 schools. And so it was the inaugural year last year. And I'm going, was the school responsible for submitting this? And then we're pulling it and it's when our database goes and we want to transfer all the info straight over there? Like, is it being funneled, from another platform, or are districts responsible for entering that and putting in those numbers? So how does that site, and then how often is it updated, right? So is it every year? Because I know like the ed site is so delayed. The numbers are like 3 years. I'm like, that's not helpful to me today. That's not helpful for a proposed budget. What happened 3 years ago? I don't care. Like, I just don't care. It's not helpful. It's not relatable. I can't use it. And I certainly can't help children who are coming into kindergarten with a budget from 3 years ago. So I really want to try to collect the most accurate data when I'm trying to write testimony or when I am addressing the Board of Education. So I'm really doing kind of my due diligence to see where that's coming from and how I can get it without literally making a FOIA request every 5 minutes of the day. So you guys can help to navigate that. That's awesome. And I love it.
I'm going to disappoint you though, Michelle. I'm really going to disappoint you because it's from EdSci. Because so how does data get to EdSci? Schools report, so districts report into EdSci. What's the delay? The delay is the state takes almost a full year to validate the data. But that's the only data that's accessible to anyone. So we use that. And so you're looking at the same data, although you're looking at it in a hopefully an easier to kind of read and navigate, and then you can compare, because the next thing after you look at your district, you're going to be like, well, wait a minute, what about this next one? And you'll start looking at that. But yeah, there are two really important things to know about data. One, even in the ECS formula, the number of students they're funding this year is based on, so the 24 to 25 school year, that funding number is based on October 2023 student counts. So there are lags and hiccups throughout the system that make it really hard. We update that as soon as we see any updates. So we try to keep it current, because the other thing is they don't drop data just once during the year. They drop pieces of data at different points in time. So as soon as something happens, we try to update that as soon as we see it. And the other thing I will tell you is that, once again, community members are the ones who shaped that whole app, everything that we needed to navigate. Melanie and I have an amazing advisory board of community members who got to play with that from the start. And again, I just want to say, right, that's important, that people who are needing this and using that are telling people what they need to see and what it actually needs to even look like to help them understand. So that's how we got there, but I still disappointed you in the end.
Okay. I am going to share my screen once more to put the QR code. I know it's 7:36. One more time, please complete the survey. And I know that Michelle put it in the chat as well, the link. Here's the QR code. I'll leave it up for a minute or so. And then, yes, we will share out the PowerPoint English and Spanish. All right, everyone. Well, this was amazing. I really, really appreciate it. It was such good information. The visuals, I think, were really helpful to make you paint the picture, like Robert said. So I think it's really good information. And I think we're going to see a lot more of us at our board, right, at our budget meetings at our districts. I can see that now. I know that I feel definitely more confident now, right, in doing that and asking the questions that I did before. So thank you so much. And again, the tool, I'm not sure when we send out the slides, I'm not sure if I could put the link to the tool that Erica shared for that bill, but I think it was awesome. It was awesome. So thank you, everyone. Have a very good night.
Good night.